All right, so today we are continuing to talk about early adulthood. Last time we talked about physical and cognitive development, so today we'll be talking about social and emotional development during this time period. That's not the right notes. Just a second. I don't know where I put my notes for today. There it is. Okay. All right, so we're going to start out by talking about relationships in early adulthood. We'll focus primarily on romantic relationships because it's one of the sort of the key developments that often happens during this early adulthood period. We'll also talk briefly, though, about friendships. Then we'll talk about the family cycle, so sort of the typical series of events that happens for most people, the decision to get married and have children, and raising those children. And we will also talk about career development, as again, this is another important aspect during this early adulthood period. And just remember, early adulthood really spans from kind of early 20s to the 40s, somewhere in that range. So that's the time period we're talking about here. So Erikson's theory is the one that we've brought up multiple times. He's the one that has 8 different stages that are framed as these sort of conflicts that you go through and you have to resolve in order to move on to the next one. And the main conflict during early adulthood is intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy is the development of permanent committed relationships, primarily focused on a romantic relationship, but also really strong, committed, intimate friendships are really important during this time as well. Intimacy gives a person a sense of independence and also helps them refine their identity. So, prior to early adulthood, most of your identity is an individual thing, but as you enter into a more committed relationship, your identity starts to take on the identity of your partner as well. A secure identity is associated with fidelity, so people who throughout adolescence were able to explore an identity and commit to one and feel very secure in that identity tend to be more likely to have successful committed relationships. Whereas if you come out of adolescence without that secure identity, then you're more likely to have less successful relationships and sometimes infidelities. Intimacy also fosters favorable friendships and work relationships. So again, it's not just romantic relationships, it's also about being able to commit to other people as well and sustain those successful relationships. If you do not come out of this stage successfully resolving with intimacy, then you may feel a sense of isolation. People who resolve this conflict through isolation tend to have a hesitancy to form close ties to other people. They may feel very lonely, very detached from their community and from others. Typically, they may resort to isolation if they have a fear of losing their identity. So maybe they get into relationships and their partners sort of challenge their identity, maybe challenge them to try other things, and they may have a fear of that. That often results in this sort of competitive nature where they feel like they're competing with their partners rather than forming, a collaboration. They tend to be rejecting of differences. They don't like to consider other people's opinions, and therefore they often are threatened by closeness. So whenever someone starts to get close to them, they may push them away or reject those close relationships. Successful resolution of this, so if you come out of this on the side of intimacy, then that prepares an individual for middle adulthood, which we'll talk more about middle adulthood, but what you experience in middle adulthood is what's called generativity, which is essentially a desire to care for the next generation and sort of provide guidance to them and advice, etc. And so coming out of this on that intimacy side is really setting you up to have those intimate, close connections that you can then share with the next generation. But like I said, we'll talk more about generativity whenever we talk about middle adulthood. Many people in early adulthood start to feel the pressure of what is sometimes termed the social clock. Many of you may be experiencing this now or sometime in the near future. This is basically age-related expectations for life events. They're driven mostly by society and the culture that you live in. So in the US, the common path that people are supposed to take is graduate from high school at 18, go to college, finish college, by your early to mid 20s, get married, have kids, right? Like you're supposed to do all those things in a particular order at a particular time. And those age-related expectations are what we refer to as the social clock. There's much greater deviation now than there was in previous generations. So it used to be the case that the social clock was really pushed onto people very hard. It may feel sometimes like social clock is pushed onto you, but it's probably not nearly to the same extent that it was for your parents or your grandparents or generations previous to us. So in other words, people are becoming much more accepting of people kind of deviating from these expectations. However, it's been shown that people who tend to stick to that social clock, who kind of follow the prescribed expectations of their society, tend to have more confidence and social stability going through early adulthood and into middle adulthood compared to those who kind of take this more risky approach of crafting a life of their own. So taking the kind of, non-normal path, maybe skipping college, maybe waiting until you're much older to get married or have kids, or not getting married and having kids at all. That would be the sort of crafting life of one's own. And not that that's a bad thing at all, but it's just been shown that people who take that path sometimes have more difficulty adjusting during early adulthood and middle adulthood as well.